For over 3 years, the world has watched as Russian forces have tried to seize control of Ukraine. But while Moscow argues that this is a response to NATO enlargement, many see the Ukraine war as a continuation of a long history of Russian expansionism. But what exactly does Russian imperialism mean in historical terms, and what does it mean today? To discuss all this, I'm joined by Professor Donnacha Ó Beacháin, the author of Unfinished Empire, Russian Imperialism in Ukraine and the Near Abroad. So, Donnacha, thanks so much for joining us. I think to get started, perhaps it would be useful to give some sense of idea of Russia as an imperial power, how it emerged and developed, and sort of maybe set a little bit of the historical context.
Sure. I mean, it's familiar, I think, to a lot of listeners who probably have grown up like I did. I'm from Ireland, so I grew up in an independent Ireland, which seceded from the British Empire, which was once the biggest empire in the world. But, you know, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Sweden, all had empires at one stage. And therefore, the Russian imperial story is one that should be familiar in some respects. One of the important differences, as I emphasize in the book, is that it's a continuous process, whereas other European empires, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, the French, all incrementally disassembled their empires over a number of years, particularly since the end of World War II. Russia still has an empire and is looking for more territory. And whereas, you know, for example, in Britain today, only the most ardent imperialist might be looking for India back or Nigeria or Egypt. In Russia, it's not uncommon, and indeed it's mainstream discourse, to talk about former colonies as future Russian possessions. And in terms of the expansion of Russia, I mean, it occurs over many centuries, and therefore it's, you know, whereas you try to, for the sake of clarity, make it a continuous whole, it is different at different times. It expands in different places at different times. So the easy wins, you might say, are the push eastwards. So after the defeat of the Tatars under Ivan IV, you know, Ivan the Terrible, as he's often known, you get this push eastwards, conquering the native peoples of Siberia. That has some comparisons to the way Europeans, for example, conquered the Native Americans. You know, they had a technological edge, and it occurred over a long period of time. It was driven by profit. It brought settlers, and you find that Russia has expanded to the Pacific Ocean by the middle of the 17th century. And that brings a lot of prosperity. Now it takes up 77% of the Russian Federation's territory, Siberia. Then they were looking for what was called kind of soft gold. I mean, essentially the pellets, the furs of animals. Now it's, of course, oil and gas, which Siberia delivers. But that wealth, which was taken from Siberia, enhanced European Russia's position. And it allowed it to then try and push into other areas to get a seat at the European table using the wealth it had derived from Asia. So you see it pushing into the Baltic region, in particular in the early 18th century. Peter the Great is the best known figure of that period. He defeats the Swedes at Poltava. Interesting that Putin mentions Peter the Great quite a lot. Indeed, during the recent talks in Istanbul, the Russian delegation said to the Ukrainians, "We fought the Swedes for 21 years. You know, we can fight you indefinitely as well." And interestingly, that victory over the Swedish Empire, it's hard to imagine the Swedes really as an imperial force today, but they were, of course, at one stage. That was not because of some leadership mastery. They simply had more men, and they wore their opponents down. This is a familiar story in the Russian imperial expanse, but it's more difficult for them to push westwards than it is eastwards. And in that sense, the Russian imperial glory is in part due to the fact of its peripherality. You know, Britain and France and the Netherlands, they have to go far afield to get their imperial possessions. Russia just invades usually its neighboring peoples when we're talking about eastwards. The possessions also westwards are often peoples who are more educated. They're therefore more likely to rebel. The Poles, for example, the Finns, the people of the Baltic states. And of course, they lose those possessions, you might say, as late as the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then, of course, you have the push down south to the Caucasus. into Ukraine. Crimea, for example, which is often now presented in the Russian media as this ancient, almost imperial Russian territory, only becomes majority Russian in the 1959 census. So again, it's in the lifetime of many people. I mean, it was the Crimean Tatars who were the largest people, the indigenous people of the peninsula. And I lived in Central Asia for many years, and I used to meet the descendants of the Crimean Tatars who were pushed out by Stalin during a weekend in 1944. They were just simply, there was a knock on the door. They were told to collect their stuff. They were put on trains. They arrived a couple of weeks later in Central Asia, and that depopulated the peninsula. It completed the work of Catherine the Great, who, of course, was the Tsarina who annexed Crimea in the 18th century. Stalin's been described as Genghis Khan with the telephone. So he, of course, had more technology at his disposal, more resources, more infrastructure. So he just depopulates Crimea in the 20th century. But that was something that, as I said, starts in the 18th century. The push into the Caucasus, it starts with Ivan IV, so it goes back to the 16th century, but it's only completed in the 19th century with particular brutality because these peoples rebelled. The Caucasus is still a tumultuous area today with many different peoples, many different languages. So the Circassians, for example, they put up a major battle, and their fate is to be completely wiped out. The Circassians today exist only as a ephemeral diaspora in Turkey. Were they around still today, if they'd been allowed to evolve unchecked in the area where they lived, which is now around the Sochi area of Russia, demographers say they probably would be about 30 million strong. But they've been completely eliminated. Their cousins, the Abkhazians, also suffered that fate. Many were moved to the Ottoman Empire. It was seen as a logical place to depose or deport people of a Muslim religion. And that was also part of the Russian imperial rationale, that they were bringing civilization, bringing Christianity. Again, this is a common European imperial story, but sometimes they were literally preaching to the converted. So when you're going into the Caucasus, you're meeting peoples like the Armenians, who were the first people to establish Christianity as a state religion in 301. So you could hardly argue that you needed to bring Christianity to them. But yet the Russian imperial juggernaut proceeds into the Caucasus. And then another area which is of particular interest to me, Central Asia, because I lived in Central Asia for 6 years, that's conquered decisively in the 19th century. The last major stand of the Central Asians is in 1881 in what's now Turkmenistan. But again, brutality, a technological kind of edge sometimes, overwhelming numbers, moving in settlers. But the 1989 census showed that, which was the last Soviet census, showed that only 44% of the population of Kazakhstan were ethnic Kazakh. And that was a direct result of kind of a long-term imperial settlement process. They've now recovered those numbers. The Kazakhs are, in terms of demography, in the ascendancy. But they were in a very weak position, and their language still is second to Russian de facto. I guess what I'm trying to say in a nutshell is that the Russian imperial story in its early and in developmental form has similarities to other European imperial processes. But one big difference is that it's a land empire and not a sea empire. The British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, they were a sea empire. That means that for the most part, when you conquered a new territory, it didn't become part of your own polity. So, the Nigerians or the Indians, they were not represented in the House of Commons, for example. Only the core of the imperial possessions, like Ireland, were represented, which is why Ireland, of course, was much more difficult to let go psychologically than those distant possessions. But for land empires, as I said, every new conquered empire became part of the centralized whole. And that creates a very different psychological attachment to those colonies. That's why many Russians consider losing territories like Ukraine as losing a limb, because for centuries it was part of the same integral whole, ruled from the same center, usually in Moscow, but sometimes in St. Petersburg. It's very difficult in the way that you acquire the territory, in the way that you govern the territory, and the way that you say goodbye to the territory. I think it's fair to say that many of the other European empires, when they did decolonize in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it didn't leave a long-term sense of psychological loss in those countries, but it did in Russia. And the last thing I'll say on this is the land empires usually collapse quite suddenly compared to the more incremental and managed form of decolonization we see with the sea empires. As I said, the British Empire decolonizes over a period of several decades. But take the Ottoman Empire, take the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and take the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire, in a sense, collapses twice, in 1917 with the Bolshevik coup and in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. They lose territory in both. As you know, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk meant that the Kremlin lost a huge amount of territory. They regained it, and indeed under Stalin, they moved the line further westwards. In a sense, there's that same sense of loss in Russia today, where people feel that the influence which they had in Soviet times was lost. And of course, one of Putin's attractive qualities for many Russians is that he has tried to regain that status and some of that territory that they had up until relatively recent times.
I think you sort of make a really interesting point of sort of bringing up that sort of revolutionary element to it, because of course, you know, as you said, I mean, you had this imperial expansion under a monarchical sort of regime in Russia, and then you had the revolution and the Bolsheviks, and it seemed that empire underwent a fundamental change. It didn't disband, but it was radically reformulated. So how I guess what I'm trying to say is how really did that change the nature of Russia's relationship with empire after 1917?
Democracy is really at the core of this. You know, the British Empire, for example, why does Ireland gain independence, or most of Ireland gain independence in 1921 and not in 1821, or indeed in 2021? It's because Britain is democratizing. The 1918 Representation of the People's Act trebled the British electorate. And it meant that, you know, when you were prosecuting a war, you had to take public opinion into account. And this is something as well when we see the end of the Portuguese Empire. It's in the mid-1970s. They give up their empire at the same time as they democratize. Russia doesn't democratize. That's one of the major reasons you don't have the internal pressure to give up the colonies, and they're oblivious to external pressure. And indeed, they see these as competitors who are trying to apply pressure on them to give up their territories. When the Kremlin began incrementally and very briefly to democratize under Gorbachev, we saw what happened. They lost Eastern Europe. Because once you had the idea that, you know, society was governed by the will of the people, you had no rationale ideologically to keep the Poles or the Czechs or the Bulgarians or the Romanians from going their own way. And it stopped, of course, at a certain point, and that's why the Russian Federation is a truncated form of what existed before. So they allowed Eastern Europe to go. They allowed the 14 other Soviet republics to go, and that was, as I said, as a result of the democratization, which led to the temporary implosion of that imperial project. So that's how they managed to retain a lot of territories for so long after other imperial empires in Europe, decolonized. It was largely because, unlike the other parts of Europe, they didn't democratize. In terms of what was different between, we'll say, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire, I mean, this is a really interesting question. And some of the slack that my approach might get are from people who, maybe have more time for the Soviet project than I would have. And they argue that it's fundamentally different. There's no question that, the ideological underpinning of empire was very different for the Soviet Union. And indeed, the economic structure of the Soviet Union was very different from Tsarist Russia, even though you could argue that the whole idea of the state owning all the property, which seemed like a really radical thing in the early 20th century, was really reverting back in a way to what had existed only a generation or two before, when you had, of course, serfdom, when the state again owned everything. People didn't have a right to private property. So they were, in a way, reverting back to that lack of private property ownership, which we consider, of course, an integral part of the kind of Western project. Of course, Soviet Union evolves. I mean, Lenin described the Russian Empire as a prison of nations, and certainly tried to create an ideological basis for self-determination among some of the republics. But as we know, he had a stroke in 1921. He died in 1924. Stalin is the one who really drives the whole Soviet project in relation to its neighbors and to nationalities. And what we see is that after an initial experiment in the 1920s, which is all about indigenization and providing maybe more assistance to those to learn their languages, to give alphabets to languages which existed, which didn't have a written literature, we find this kind of Russia first approach taking off again, or reverting back to the template in the 1930s and 40s, and it never really ceases then for the remainder. So, the positive aspects in terms of literacy and in terms of indigenization are really a temporary phenomenon of the 1920s, which, as I said, evaporate really by the 1930s. So we see in the textbooks that they use in the Soviet Union an inability to see the Tsarist Empire as anything other than a progressive force in terms of bringing civilization to other nations. Of course, they criticize the economic structures in Soviet history books of the Tsarist project, but those historians in, for example, Kazakhstan, who try to or the Caucasus, who tried to show that the Russian imperial project under the Tsars was bad for those nations. It was about violently acquiring territory. They're considered to be anti-Russian, and to be anti-Russian is considered to be anti-Soviet, not to be internationalist, because the Russian language and the Russian culture is the glue, the ethnic glue that keeps the Soviet Union together. I mean, Russian is the only language with which you can travel throughout the Soviet Union and communicate with people. So Russians don't have to learn any other language, but all other nations have to learn Russian to survive in the Soviet structures. I mean, there was a classic example I mentioned in the book in 1943. So in the middle of World War II, they had time to be interested in such things, where there's a book called A Short History of the Kazakh People that's created, and it has a very critical view of the Russian imperial times, and essentially it's made to change its emphasis completely, and it's not allowed to be published, and that had a demonstration effect among historians. They knew that they couldn't criticize Tsarist Russia in a way that would seem like the colonial expansion was what it was, imperial. And then you have, simple things like even the Soviet national anthem. The only country that's mentioned is Russia, and it said how great Rus has welded together all these people. So the way it was presented was that communism was the final stage of human history. And because Russians had crossed the finishing line first, they almost had a duty to bring this civilizing mission to other countries. So it was kind of an updated rationale for imperialism. So instead of being Christianity, it was communism, but it was also expansionist, as we saw. And after, of course, Nazi Germany is defeated, which is the defining victory for the Soviet Union, we find that the liberation, temporary as it is replaced by occupation. And that is something that is up to this day a taboo topic that you cannot interrogate. The liberation myth, as you might call it, that Russian forces, Soviet forces liberate Europe, which is why that when you see the statues being taken down in Estonia or Poland, it's attributed to Russophobia. But these countries were not allowed, and this is of course a variant of the debates we see about NATO and EU membership. These countries were not allowed to determine their own geopolitical future. In fact, it falls back to this very good maxim of the American diplomat George Kennan, who said in the 1940s that Russia could only conceive of two types of neighbors, those who were enemies and those who were vassals. And, a country that was determined to be one would have to reconcile, that it could never change its kind of designation. So if you were going to be a vassal, that was fine. If you were going to be an enemy, that was your fate in the structure of things. So the Soviet Union was different from the Russian Empire, but it was also a continuation of a process which they had experienced beforehand.
That sort of then brings us to the third phase, if you like. So if we could talk of imperial Tsarist Russia, and then obviously the Soviet Union. And then we had the final collapse of the Soviet Union. And again, you sort of mentioned about you had the 15 republics, they went their own way. I mean, how did ordinary Russians see see that process?
Well, it was very difficult for people because it wasn't expected, it wasn't managed. And their, state went from being a world superpower, which was respected, indeed feared, to being a beggar nation, looking for handouts, unable to feed its people. A lot of people during those early years were just struggling to survive. So their own micro situation, in a way, reflected the decline of their state. But for those who had the luxury of thinking beyond survival, there was that sense of loss. There was that sense that this was a truncated nation. Nobody had seen this map before of the Russian Federation. It looked odd. It was difficult to digest. It was difficult to accept these new post-colonial neighbors. That's why we have this term kind of the near abroad. It suggests familiarity. It even suggests perhaps temporary separation, not necessarily a final divorce. And you have a lot of people compare 1990s Russia to Weimar Germany, where you have economic upheaval, you have indebtedness, you have the extremes developing, political entrepreneurs with easy solutions to deeply embedded problems, and ultimately a desire for strong leadership to get the country out of the problems in which it finds itself. And there's no shortage of political entrepreneurs in 1990s post-Soviet Russia. You have on the right, of course, fascistic Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who grows up in Almaty, Kazakhstan's largest city, and has this kind of victim mentality that he was persecuted as a Russian living in Kazakhstan. And he talks of, Russians, washing their boots in the Indian Ocean. He has this, that the natural borders of Russia are, including all of Central Eastern Europe and going down to the Indian Ocean and, of course, the Pacific Ocean. So it's very much looking to expand at a very time when Russia has contracted radically. And then on the left, you have the communists who also have this view that the Soviet Union was illegally disestablished. They want to revive the whole Soviet project. They think Stalin is a great figure, which, by the way, resonates with what opinion polls show in terms of what contemporary Russians think. So, and then you have, of course, this Yeltsin, therefore, is kind of the man in the middle who implements this shock therapy, which is more shock than therapy. And he's not a Democrat really at heart, but he's the best of the woeful alternatives that exist from a Western perspective. And ultimately, democracy never really gets embedded in Russian political culture. I mean, and when we look at the long picture of Russian history, I mean, it is long periods of authoritarian rule punctuated by brief, chaotic transitions from one form of an autocracy to another. And that's what we're seeing in 1990s Russia. Just as we saw in 1917, there was an opportunity, there was a chance, at least a theoretical chance, of taking a more democratic path, but ultimately they reverted to a variation of the authoritarian template. And that's cemented when Vladimir Putin comes to power, and this kind of passage of the crown, as it were, from Yeltsin to Putin, which is interesting in that it's very much kind of a bloodless revolution, because most of Russia's leaders either died in office or there was a coup, or in the case of Gorbachev, the regime collapsed around him. I think that the kind of transition at the time is rather unheralded between Yeltsin and Putin. Now we know Putin, of course, is a leader of 25 years standing, but at the time he was almost completely anonymous. But his project has been very much to revive Russia's place in the world, in alliance with other autocratic, powers, particularly China. So the long and short of it is that Russia is in a very difficult place in the 1990s. They try to regain some of what they have lost. And of course, the big battle is over Chechnya. Chechnya is Putin's first war. Indeed, it was Yeltsin's war as well. Putin is now on his fifth war. And the Chechens are a litmus test for how Russia is regaining its strength. And that's why, of course, Yeltsin is condemned by virtue of the fact that he can't defeat the Chechens in the 1990s. But Putin's first victory is over the Chechens. And that's setting the stage for, of course, further expansionist endeavors in the 2000s and onward.
I guess this sort of moves us on to if you like, the next stage of things, which is the conflicts that we've seen in Georgia and specifically Ukraine. And I mean, there's been all sorts of discussion about what are the motivating factors for what Russia has done in Ukraine. And obviously there's that side that would say, well, it was all about NATO expansion and this. But I think obviously a lot of people see this as a natural continuation of this long-held Russian imperial ambitions. And where would you come at it in terms of trying to explain that positioning that we've seen with Putin over Ukraine?
Yeah, well, it's not about NATO expansion. This much we know for sure. If it was about NATO expansion, then Russia would have invaded Finland. The border of NATO and Russia doubled with the accession of Finland to NATO in relatively recent times. And as we've seen, both Finland and Sweden, overcame decades, and in the case of Sweden, centuries of military non-alignment and neutrality for NATO membership because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So, and in 2022, Ukraine was no closer to joining NATO than it had been for many years. As you will know, it was the Bucharest summit in 2008 when President Yushchenko of Ukraine petitions, along with Georgia, for NATO membership, and they're turned down. They don't get the membership action plan. They get a vague promise that someday in the future, not defined, they will join, but there's no plan, and it's clearly a SOP. It's clearly a way of smoothing over the differences which exist within NATO, because of course you have to have a consensus. And, in 2021, 2022, when Putin's making these demands on Ukraine, Ukraine is no closer to joining NATO. And I would argue that it's not because of an imminent threat that Ukraine poses to Russia, that's why Russia invades. It's because of Ukraine's weakness. I mean, why was Ukraine invaded, for example, and not Estonia? I mean, Estonia's population is just 1.2 million. So it's, 35 times smaller than Ukraine's population. And yet it would be an easy target. They have an ethnic Russian minority of about 20-25%. But Ukraine is invaded because it's not a member of a military alliance and is not likely to be a member of a military alliance anytime soon. And of course, there was the first invasion to build on from 2014. And that emboldened, of course, Putin, because the consequences, the repercussions, the punishments were minimal. And he had a longer-term project. So and even the term NATO expansion is, of course, very pejorative. I think enlargement is like we talk about the EU, is a more accurate term, because this is not about an organization expanding eastwards. It's about sovereign democracies making choices to move westwards. And these are countries, most of which are quite small. Latvia, Slovakia, most of them are much smaller than Russia, but they have been victims of a historical cycle of abuse which they wanted to escape. And that's why during the 1990s, when Russia was temporarily weak, as we've just discussed, they formed a queue to join NATO. And they knew that this was their chance, that Russia would try and mobilize again, would be resurgent, and that they had to take the chance while they could. And history has proven the wisdom of those decisions, because we can only guess what would have happened to Estonia or Latvia or these smaller countries had they not come under the NATO umbrella, security umbrella, which now, of course, is being undermined by Donald Trump and his approach to NATO, but up until relatively recently was considered to be a hard security guarantee that Russia would respect. So the other reasons that Russia has given, denazification, of course, was the one that Putin mentions in his speech. Of course, that resonates with the Russian population because of the whole victory in World War II narrative, which I briefly mentioned. It's, of course, a particularly difficult one to apply to Ukraine. Its president is Jewish. And indeed, when he became president, the prime minister was also Jewish. So Ukraine was the only country, apart from Israel, which had a Jewish president and prime minister. Not, you would think, fertile soil for Nazism to develop. And indeed, in their 450-seat legislature, not one single member elected by party list is from a far-right party. You compare that to France or Germany, or Hungary, it's quite a good position to be in terms of far-right politics. And fascism, of course, has flourished in Russia. So it's like it's a peculiar argument to use, but it's one nonetheless that's used, and it's been consistently amplified on the Russian media, which starts out with kind of a narrative that the Ukrainians are just like us. They are, they're victims of false consciousness. They just need some kind of national lobotomy because they've been brainwashed by Westerners who want to undermine Russia, and they're being used as a spearhead against Russia. But then once they're not welcomed with flowers, once it's clear that that narrative doesn't really resonate with Ukrainians, you do get this very vicious turn, which explains events like Bucha and Irpin, of course, on the ground, but also in the Russian media, where Ukrainians are, always referred to as things like toxins, cancers, viruses. There's only one way that you can eliminate such things, and so they talk about eliminating many Ukrainians and resocializing those who remain. It's certainly not one that's based on compromise or inclusivity. And as you will remember, of course, at the beginning of the war, Putin's territorial ambitions, his stated ones, are more modest certainly than they are today. He starts off by saying that he doesn't have any territorial ambitions, and by September 2022, he's announcing the annexation of Kherson and Zaporizhia, in addition to Donetsk and Luhansk, which he recognizes first as independent states, bizarrely in February 21st, just 3 days before the full-scale invasion. And some people thought then that perhaps this was his strategy, was kind of having some kind of proxies that he could exert leverage on Ukraine to stall its movement westwards. But ultimately we see that it's straightforward classic imperialism. He just wants the territory, not really interested in the people, certainly not Ukrainians who want to be Ukrainian and speak Ukrainian, but definitely interested in the territory. It's always bizarre to outside observers how Russia, the largest country in the world by far, spanning 11 time zones, always seems to be on the lookout for new territory. Even Estonia and Latvia had portions of them taken after World War II, Japanese, the Kuril Islands and whatnot. And today, there are other parts again. And I interviewed, for example, for the research for the book, President of Moldova, Maya Sandu, and she's quite clear that the only reason that Moldova exists today is because Ukraine separates them from Russia, and that the Ukrainian resistance is essentially a bulwark which protects, at least at the moment, Moldova from Russian expansionism. So this is an expansionist regime, not unique in European history, as I've argued, but certainly in contemporary Europe, unique. And that's what makes the current situation more dangerous than during the Cold War, because we sometimes hear the term used in popular articles, the new Cold War. This is kind of getting back to this two tribes, the Western and kind of Russian autocratic one. But it's more dangerous because during the Cold War that I grew up with, there was an Iron Curtain, which was respected by both sides. So when the Hungarians rose up in 1956 or the Czechoslovaks in 1968, even though they appealed for help to the West, they weren't going to get any. And similarly, we knew that the Soviet Union wasn't going to invade, or it was extraordinarily unlikely that it was going to invade Western countries. The rest of the world was fair game. That's why you had competition in Africa and Asia and whatnot. But Europe, it was stable. The current regime in the Kremlin does not have a fixed view of its borders in Europe. As I said, they constantly change. And that's why countries like Estonia, like Moldova, fear that, how the war in Ukraine ends will determine also their own future.
There is a school of thought that says that Ukraine would be the end of the story, that once Putin gets what he wants there, then, talk of trying to take the Baltic republics is just exaggeration. It's bluster. It's not going to happen. But it does seem, from what you've said, that you think that this is something that's much more deeply embedded, certainly in Putin's mindset. But also, what is the sense, as far as you can tell, amongst ordinary Russians about all of this? You brought up a really good point, that something I think that a lot of us who look at this situation do wonder is, how much territory can be enough? I mean, this is the largest country in the world. It's enormous. It's double the size of Canada, the next largest country. And yet it always seems to be about expansion. And equally, not 1 inch will be ever given away. And it just seems such an interesting, odd, dangerous mindset to have.
Yeah, no, it's what makes, as I said, Russia unique at the moment is that kind of expansionist project, which is popular in Russia. I mean, again, this is a thing that I tried to address in the book, that this is not something that's necessarily, Putin alone. I mean, Putin is simply the latest in a long list of autocrats which have led Russia. But Putin's popularity increases when he goes to war. This is Putin's fifth war. And each war that he's been involved in has emboldened him. There haven't been, as I said, consequences or punishments. So it is a very difficult and fluid situation, and the neighbors are nervous because what I say about the project isn't just based on my own analysis. It's by listening to the neighbors. I mean, I've lived for more than a decade in the region, but always on you might say, the periphery of Russia, even though I've traveled to Russia many times. But it's the neighbors who, unfortunately, are rarely listened to, who have been talking about this for many years. And in Western countries, particularly the United States, but also in the EU, we've had a tendency to have a Russia first approach, and that you even go back to the so-called Chicken Kyiv speech that George W. Bush made to the Ukrainians in August 1991, when he was begging them not to leave the Soviet Union, not interested in their own nationalist freedom aspirations, only interested in assuaging Gorbachev's apprehensions, and of course their own fears about what would happen if the Soviet Union imploded. And we have those same fears today. Why does Ukraine not get more support? It's because of this notion that, if you give Ukraine more support, you escalate the conflict, and that means that Russia's a nuclear power. Who knows where this may lead? Of course, Russia also is involved in nuclear saber rattling. So we end up in this stalemate, which I think is actually artificial, because if Ukraine was given sufficient support, I think that it has demonstrated that with the support that it gets in a very asymmetrical war, it uses it very adeptly, because they are, of course, motivated by liberating their country, whereas Russians are motivated by a less kind of glorious and sentimental project in Ukraine. A point I often make is that Russia's economy is smaller than that of Italy's. Its population is dwindling and substantially smaller than Nigeria's, but it punches above its weight because of its investment in the military-industrial complex, which is something that Ukraine has tried to catch up with, but without external support is unlikely to be able to counter indefinitely. Even a country like North Korea, which can't feed its people, supplies Russia with more ammunition than the EU can supply Ukraine. But within Russia itself, the regime still is fragile, despite this outward kind of projection of power, which is what, of course, the invasion is all about. It is fragile, and we saw that with that amazing day, Saturday in June in 2023, when you had the Prigozhin rebellion, when one man and his merry men who were following him took Rostov-on-Don, which was the headquarters for the Russian military endeavors in Ukraine, one of the top 10 cities in Russia, and then marched 800 kilometers in a day, without being stopped. And there was no mass mobilization of society. Remember, even when you had the coup in 1991, when Gorbachev was apprehended when he was on holidays in Crimea, there was a mass mobilization in Gorbachev's defense, admittedly led by Boris Yeltsin. But when Prigozhin was pushing his way through Russia, there was no mass mobilization in favor of Putin. And the lesson that I took from that, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that, is that Russian civil society as such is so kind of demobilized that it's kind of passively waiting to see what will happen at elite level. Because let's face it, I mean, Russia has never had a democracy. It's always been elite pacts that have kind of ushered in a transition from one autocrat to another. So most of Russian society is at least in terms of elite politics in Russia, it's waiting this one out. That said, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, most Russians obviously want Russia to win. That is a base, but the amount that they have invested in it emotionally depends often on things like age. It depends on what part of Russia they're from. The younger are less enthusiastic about the war than the older. The younger will have to fight it. Many Russians have fled to Central Asia and the Caucasus. I've met many of them in Tbilisi and in Central Asia, and they filled those gaps in the Russian army with Central Asians. I mean, one of the things that this war has underlined, and it's something I emphasize in the book, is the colonial dynamic, within Russia. You're much more likely, I mean, something in the region of, 100 times more likely to die per capita if you're from Buryatia than if you're from Moscow. The Tuvash people, others are being thrown into the conflict much more readily than kind of white Slavs living in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But also the dynamic with Central Asia, where, there's about 10 million Central Asians working in Russia. Many of them are being, shepherded into fighting in Ukraine by a combination of coercion and carrot. So, Russia's project is difficult to sustain in the longer term, but now it's at a war economy footing. Only Russia and Ukraine, of course, are on that war economy footing, but it'd be very difficult, in the absence of a victory, to pull out, because so much has been invested in this. I mean, Putin, this comes down to the core issue of the nature of the governing structures in Russia. How does Putin exit this? And indeed, how does he even envisage transitioning from power? And what I argue in the book is that, he's seen what happened in Kazakhstan, where Nazarbayev tried to, give an acolyte power while he would kind of sit in the background. It didn't work out. There was, of course, upheaval in Kazakhstan. So Putin is going to leave horizontally, if he's allowed to leave horizontally. But he's seen what's happened in Syria with Bashar al-Assad. Of course, no coincidence that his retirement home is in Moscow. He's seen what happened with Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein. So he knows that the stakes are very high in a dictatorship if things go wrong, if you lose that sense of invulnerability, which defeat in a war brings. And that's why the stakes, of course, are very high, not just, of course, for people in Ukraine, who are, of course, the primary focus, but also in Russia as well.
I've got one more question, and I think this sort of ties in really nicely to this, is that, you raised the intriguing element about how land empires can suddenly collapse. And this is one of the really interesting elements, I think, that sort of when you look at Russia and you look at the size of it and you look at the way that it's taken on all these territories, and there have been a lot of comments about its fragility in some senses, that there is this sort of sense that maybe Russia could disintegrate. But balanced against that, there's also this sort of sense that Russia is, it's been very, very successful in making a lot of these far-flung places very Russian ethnically. Where do you see this balance? I mean, is this a country that, given its size, given everything that we're seeing at the moment, and I obviously realize a lot could be contingent on what happens in Ukraine, but where do you see sort of Russia's future? Is this a country, I suppose what I'm trying to ask, that you could see fragmenting?
Oh, it's a really interesting question, and of course very difficult to answer. If it fragmented, I mean, if it had a defeat at elite level that meant the power structure collapsed in Moscow, would it be like 1991 Part 2 or Part 3, or would it be something else? I think some nations in the Russian Federation are conceptually, at least, ready for a conversation about independence if the opportunity arose. Among them might be the Chechens, they might be the Tatars, they might be the Bashkirs. But there are other nations, as you rightly point out, who have been colonized for so long that they haven't really even thought about it as a prospect. And it would be an imposition almost to say that, because they are a different nation that were colonized, that it's, axiomatic that they are going to look for independence. They might just simply look around for what new regime emerges. And of course, you have to remember that there are Russians existing in a lot of these republics as well. One republic that I'm very familiar with is Buryatia. I spent 4 different summers in Buryatia by Lake Baikal, and it's been heavily colonized over the years. Russian is the language. The Buryat people are a minority in Buryatia. So even though they have a sense of their history, I don't think they see it as a realistic project to look for independence. And of course, as I've mentioned, the war has had a disproportionate effect on people in Buryatia, because even though they're very far away from the front lines, they've been disproportionately thrown into the fighting. So it would really depend on regions. I think in the Caucasus, Chechen-led, you could have quite a lot of activity if the opportunity arose. But there are others, as I said, which I don't think they have the economic resources, but also the, almost the intellectual national project that they could kind of put at their disposal if the opportunity arose. And that's why it would be ad hoc. It would be unpredictable. And I think that's why a lot of people aren't looking forward to such a prospect, because of the unpredictability. And it's not something, I think that a lot of sometimes you hear it said that this is kind of part of the project. You know, if you're looking to save Ukraine from the Russian invasion, that you have as your endpoint a collapse of Russia as a state and the emboldening of all these nations. I don't think that's the case. I think what most people would like to see is a Russia that is, you know, democratic, and a democratic Russia, one that's based on basic, you know, democratic values, might be a place that many of these nations long subordinated would be happier in. It doesn't necessarily follow that every nation has to have a nation state. So it is a debate. There are communities out there debating it. Sometimes they claim to represent more people in these republics in Russia than they perhaps do. But it would be very much, as I said, based on each individual region and each individual people. And as I said, the Caucasus probably, along with Tatarstan, would be the ones most likely to push for more, along with the Bashkirs as well. But others, as I said, I don't see them having realistic prospects, only because they themselves don't see it.
Donnacha, thank you so much for joining us to talk through all of this. It's been absolutely fascinating listening to all of this. And I'll put a link to your new book, Unfinished Empire, in the description below, and highly recommended. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much, James, for the invitation.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.